It's my pleasure as the chair of the Executive Committee of the World Congress of Faiths to welcome everybody to our little gathering. We're going to have a conversation, essentially that, on the climate emergency and where we've got to with it. What, 3.5 months since COP26? At that time, it seemed that the whole world, certainly the media in this part of the world, was talking about nothing else. So the COP was billed as the final chance for nations to agree steps to hold global warming rises to no more than 1.5 degrees by 2050. I don't know about you, but I've not read anything since which says we're on track to meet those targets. In fact, there's daily reports from many a reputable research body strongly suggesting the direction of travel has gone a bit into reverse. We can be forgiven, I think, if we veer between sort of despair and a modicum of hope on a daily basis. And that, for me, I have to confess, is very much one dimension of what we might call the spirituality of our climate emergency. There are many other dimensions too, of course, and we'll get into some of those, I hope, during our discussion. I'm thinking of justice for poorer nations already suffering climate effects. I'm thinking whether our economics can be greened up in time, or whether our religious institutions are being sufficiently proactive in the face of the challenges for change that we need to make. But of course, we need to reflect on the issues from an informed basis and what are the values we need to embrace if we're going to be effective agents of change. All of which leads me gladly to introduce our two conversationalists this evening. They were both present at COP26 and both are, can I put it like this, sort of veterans of the cause. So first, it's a welcome to Dr. Maureen Cyr. She's worked in the field of interfaith relations for many a year in Europe, in America, Asia, Pacific, and so on. She served on the coordinating committee of the European Women of Faith Network, and in 2007 received the US-UK Fulbright International Interfaith Scholarship. She's currently the director of Interfaith Scotland and has recently served on the Scottish Government Social Renewal Advisory Board. I don't know when she gets time to go to bed. That board looks at constructive ways forward for the Scottish Government coming out of COVID-19 and beyond. Might be a bit of a way to go for that. In the build-up to COP and during it, Maureen played a pivotal role providing platforms for faith communities and interfaith groups to engage on the key issues of the climate crisis. I think I'm right in saying Maureen belongs to the Baha'i tradition. Next up, we have Lucy Plummer. She's a member of Religions for Peace UK's Interfaith Youth Network. She's a youth member of the Soka Gakkai International Buddhist Network in the UK. And she works in youth development and youth empowerment and currently coordinates youth forums for the NHS. That sounds massive. And the Bank of England sounds even more massive with the British Youth Council. She's a master's in sustainable development and is a researcher in youth participation in climate policy making. She says she likes to talk from the heart about what the COP conference meant for her. Well, what we'll do is we'll let the two of you share together for maybe half an hour or so, no more, and then we'll call in responses from the witnesses on the screen, and I hope that seems fair to everybody. When it comes to wanting to raise a point or ask a question, you need to put your hand up with the little icons at the bottom or write in a chat somewhere. and we'll pick it up. Okay, so that's my introduction. Who's going to start us up between the two of you?
I think we decided, didn't we, Lucy, that I'd ask the first question of you. So first of all, just want to say it's really wonderful to be here with you all tonight, and even more great to be here with Lucy. We've actually been on a couple of platforms, I think, together during COP26, and we connected. And in fact, when we were chatting last week about this upcoming event, we were sort of saying that even at those events, we felt a kind of a heart connection, and it was, so it's really nice to be with you and to be here with Lucy and to be able to just ask Lucy some of the questions that I want to ask, and vice versa, I'm sure, for Lucy with me. So I'm going to kick off with the first question to Lucy, and I just wanted to ask, because you're such an active young person, is your full-time work related to the climate crisis? And is this what you do in your day job?
Thank you so much, Maureen. And just quickly, I just want to mirror how wonderful it is to be with everyone here this evening. Yeah, I hope you find this conversation interesting, maybe inspiring. But so yeah, Maureen, I don't work full time in the climate scene. Actually, I'm relatively new, and I hope to be going more in towards that direction. So I'm a youth worker. My background's in youth work, and in about 2016, I had this like urge to be a travel writer. So I kind of left youth work behind, and I went over to India, and I ended up spending 4 years there, and that's where I really became quite connected to like environmental issues. And it was really from, I guess I fell in love with this small village in the Himalayas, and I would visit every year for 4 years during that time. And I was just astounded by the growth and the development of this village in that small space of time, and not in a good way. It was just so much more tourism each year, and I got quite friendly with the locals, and they would tell me stories about how they remember this village in the wintertime would have lots of snow, and now they haven't seen snow there for many years. And they would tell me stories about it being quite an agricultural village, and now it's heavily dependent on tourism. So I just growing up in London, it was easy for me not to see environmental issues. So I think spending time with these people and in these villages and so close to nature, I really saw that this is actually a real big problem that is affecting people's lives and livelihoods, and we need to do something about it. So I came back to the UK and decided to study sustainable development. So I took like a completely new direction, and it was very difficult because I don't have any technical skills. I don't have a background in development, but I just felt there was a way in for me to try and do something based on my experiences. And I guess from my studies, I found a way to bring in my interest in youth as well. So I started to look at how young people are involved in sustainability and climate action, and I ended up doing my research. I interviewed young people from all around the world who participate at the COPs, and I just wanted to hear about their experiences and what are their visions for a climate resilient future. So yeah, I ended up doing my research, and then I was given the invitation to be at COP26, which was wonderful. So and now I've just applied for a PhD where I hope to continue looking at the ways that young people are engaging in climate action and what is the impact of that. So yes, I don't work at the moment. I'm working, as was said by Alan, in youth participation in health and finance policy, but I really hope to become more involved in the climate side of things going forward. So that's kind of my road in. What about you, Maureen? When do you work fully on climate or lots of other issues?
Do you know, it's interesting because actually, I mean, obviously I'm director of Interfaith Scotland, so I work full time on interfaith issues, and And it's really interesting being in that space as a director of an interfaith organisation, because you're very often asked to engage with all sorts of things that you're not an expert on, absolutely not an expert on. But because you're in that interfaith space, they'll say, you know, will you hold a dialogue on poverty, on homelessness, on, you know, everything that relates to life and society? Because of course faith communities have got something to say about everything. And but the climate crisis, I think it was the fact that COP was coming to Glasgow, and you know, my husband and I are very connected with sustainability. You know, we grow our own vegetables. We lived in the South Pacific, a bit like you living in India, and we're very aware of how the climate crisis was impacting on Pacific Island nations. And some of our closest friends work for SPREC, the South Pacific Regional Environment Programme. We had dear friends in Australia who lost everything. They had a sustainable 90 acres of land that was their dream, absolute dream place. They'd left, we met them in Samoa, we'd stayed friends with them through their life in Australia. And in fact, it's a sad story really, because it was New Year's Eve 2 years ago, and we got a phone call and we thought, it's Christina and James, they're phoning up to wish us a happy new year. And they went, we're in a field with 70 neighbours surrounded by flames. We don't actually know if we're going to survive, and we just needed to connect with you. And then they said, we've got low battery, we're passing this round all our friends, and please pray for us. It was just horrendous, you know, because we'd only just been with them. And, you know, he is an environmentalist that was committed to getting some of the endangered species back into their 90 acres of bushland, including this fish that hadn't been seen for years, called something like the Intergalactica. It's a weird name, but and they lost everything in the bushfire, and it was immediately followed by terrible floods that then brought slush and mud, and so this beautiful environment became absolutely horrendous. And this was just, you know, a year and a half, if you like, before the climate crisis, or 20 months before the COP coming to Glasgow. And so it just felt like this is the dialogue, this is the conversation that we have to be having. This is what, you know, is this, not just the zeitgeist of the moment, it's the zeitgeist for humanity over the next decades and decades to come. It's what we have to focus on. And so I was thinking, you know, I'm absolutely not an expert in the climate crisis. I have no expertise in that area at all. But I felt that what people needed to do, what I needed to do, was look at, you know, what can I do, and how can I, you know, what would happen. So we made last year leading up to COP, you know, the year of climate action. We worked with Interfaith Glasgow, and it's lovely to see Saba here with us. You know, and they created a platform for an interfaith engagement around COP, them being in Glasgow themselves. We worked with the Religious Leaders Forum to have multi-faith statements and statements of commitment, and made Scottish Interfaith Week the year you know, Together for Our Planet, same theme as COP, and just felt like our role was to bring together the faith communities, to galvanize the faith communities, for the faith communities to have a voice and to say what was in their hearts and their souls, because there was something in me that felt that we didn't have a climate crisis. The climate doesn't know it's having a crisis. The climate's doing what the climate is doing. What we have is a spiritual, a moral, an ethical, and a human crisis. And it's our response to the world of nature, how we're living out of sync with the natural world, and how our greed and our apathy and our insatiable appetite for more is actually causing a crisis. And the crisis is for us. You know, if we don't exist anymore on the planet, the climate will just find its equilibrium and carry on. So it's not in crisis, we're in crisis. And I felt it was a deeply spiritual crisis. And that was where I thought it was so important to have the voice of faith communities absolutely there in that space, in that public space, and doing what they can. And many faith communities have already done sterling work over years and decades around the climate crisis. This was just our space as an interfaith space. So how do we bring together all these amazing voices and faith communities and people to have a bigger impact? And so that was our space. So now it's kind of funny that COP is over and thinking, well, we need to continue this conversation, that there's so many other conversations that are also happening, and trying to balance all of that. You know, there's COVID, there's health and well-being, there's people suffering low mental health at the moment because of these years of isolation and challenge. So I'm really in a liminal space where we're thinking, okay, next steps, what are they? What do we do now? How do we do it? What is the role of an interfaith organisation right at this moment in history? But I know, Lucy, that we were kind of in two very different spaces in a way in COP. You know, like you were in the blue zone, and all these world shaking delegates were there, you know, doing their thing and coming up with the big decisions. And we made a very conscious decision to be in outside of the blue zone in civil society, and really in all the spaces outside of that zone where people were engaging and making their presence felt. So what was the blue zone like for a young, dynamic person like yourself to be right in there doing, you know, and did you get to do anything?
Yeah, I have pretty mixed feelings about it, actually. I was thrilled to be able to have the opportunity to attend and see what it was like. And I had a good idea of what to expect, because I had been having so many conversations with young people who'd been at previous COPs. But obviously this COP was completely different because it was happening during a pandemic. And obviously it had been postponed. So it was the first real time that we were having this conference in this kind of post-COVID space. So I guess it's funny, I had an observer badge, but I don't feel like I was able to observe much, because a lot of the events were like closed doors. So even though I had a badge and I could go into the conference and supposedly like observe the negotiations and stuff, I spent a lot of my time on my laptop, like watching the live streams of things that were happening like in the room next door to me. So I mean, there was lots of kind of excuses that, you know, COVID, so we have to have limited capacity. But I just thought, like, there's some people that have come here from like all corners of the world. They've flown here. I don't know how they've managed, the youth that I spoke to, like how they managed to get here and to be able to not get into the rooms and actually be able to interact or kind of say anything, not even say anything, but even just to be in that space and see was very disappointing. So that was kind of the first real thing. Was I spent a lot of time wandering around the corridors and just kind of just talking to people. So that was a bit disappointing. It also felt like very corporate, very business-like. Something I vividly remember is, so each day of the COP was a different theme. And I remember finance was one of the first days, and that day was full. Like there was so many people in suits and just like business attire, and you had to queue for a long time to get in. And then you compare that to Youth Day, which was on the first Friday, and it was just a completely different atmosphere. There was just so much less people there. I don't remember queuing that day. So I just kind of got a sense that kind of, the priority is just a bit off for me. So that was something else that I found a bit disturbing, and a lot of the young people are calling it like climate tourism. So yeah, that was very unfortunate. And just another thing that I wanted to discuss was the fact that there was no real space to have like dialogues. There was a lot of like networking opportunities, and I said like, it was very kind of like business, but actually to have like real heart-to-heart dialogue with others was very difficult. And there was this one youth organization, I don't remember who they were, but they were trying to bring as many young people together who were in the conference to have dialogues, but we couldn't find any room. So we were gathering in corridors, like sitting in small groups on the floor in corridors wherever we could. And we kept getting like shifted along by security. But we thought it was so important to just talk about how we felt there, to have spaces where we could like reflect and have dialogue. So that was quite difficult. There was a space in something called the pavilion, which was where there was lots of stools, and you can apply to have like a stool. And there was one space for reflection, but it was like right on the outskirts of the pavilion, which was just so busy. So it was not really like a space where you could really feel that you can have that dialogue and reflection. So yeah, it was quite a weird experience for me, but I was also participating on fringe events in the community, and it was like experiencing two completely different COPs. And I know that we've met quite a few times in the Interfaith, and you were mostly like on the outside. And how was the experience for you? What was going on there?
Yeah, I suppose I have to say the outside felt very vibrant, very alive, very engaged, from pilgrimages to interfaith prayer and meditation vigils, to events, to dialogues, to street marches. The climate justice march had 100,000 people at it. I mean, it was just alive. And, you know, it was like humanity was pouring its heart and soul out and saying, listen to us, please listen to us. And I find it quite moving to think of that stark difference of you having to sit in corridors and whatnot. And you probably don't know this, but Stop Climate Chaos, the International Liaison Committee, and the Interfaith Working Group, a whole load of faith communities put in an amazing application to have a space right in the middle of the Blue Zone for dialogue, for reflection, for prayer, for refreshment. And we were going to call it the welcome space. And it was honestly, it was a brilliant application, and, you know, really supported by, you know, so many organisations in Scotland, and they just turned it down completely. Because those who had been at previous COPs from faith communities and young people and Indigenous people said, there is nowhere to go to just, even just breathe in for a moment, you know, to meditate, to pray, to have a conversation with someone, to have a cup of tea that, you know, and in a connected way. And so it's kind of reinforced for me in my mind that that space should have been given. It really should have been. And it should have been there, and there should have been somewhere that, or could have been, perhaps shoot's a bit of a demanding word, but it could have been there for you to, you know, yourselves and others to be there and relax and reflect. And even for the delegates also, because there was a sense that delegates who've been at previous COPs say it's an exhausting and unreal world to be in, you know, just and feeling that you have the weight, and you literally have the weight of the world upon your shoulders. And, you know, so it would have been fantastic to have that. But outside of that space, there was the green zone, and then there was civil society, wider society. And the green zone I heard was a little bit like an Ideal Homes exhibition. I don't know if it was that terribly different to the blue zone, but the civil society was alive. And I don't know if it was alive just because we were working so hard in that space that you feel the aliveness because you're engaged. But I don't think so. I think, you know, our prayer and meditation in Vigil in George Square at the opening day of COP was actually, for me, was just a cosmic moment. It was just incredible. And you know, it moved. That was at the beginning, and then a week later to be marching, demanding climate justice with faith communities and others, you know, obviously much wider society, just sort of saying, and I really felt people were saying, please, please listen. You know, the world really wants you to do something about this. But I mean, there was a wonderful homestay network, so that was Stop Climate Chaos created. And so the welcome and the hospitality that was offered by faith communities and others was quite incredible. And I found that really uplifting. We opened our home and we had people stay with us throughout COP from, you know, we had Chloe from the from New York Interfaith, she stayed with us. We had someone from the International Environment Forum staying with us. We had 2 Extinction Rebellion folks stay with us. I mean, we've only got a 2-bedroom house. I don't know where we fitted them all in, but somehow. But that kept the Blue Zone alive for me, because these were people who were in the Blue Zone, particularly the International Environment Forum participants were definitely in the Blue Zone. Maya Roth was her name. And so she was reporting in a very similar way to you are, the kind of, basically it's quite frustrating, quite difficult to be there, because we've got so much hope that things will, you know, would be different. So yeah. But anyway, I suppose getting to maybe just because I'm here and in an interfaith kind of context, I'm wondering, I know, Lucy, that you are a Buddhist, and I'm just wondering how that felt to you. What does your faith tradition sort of, what role does that play in all of this for you? So your work is a little bit different, but your studies is now moving into this field. What about your faith tradition, the Buddhist?
Yeah, so I've been practicing Nichiren Buddhism for around 11 years. And I'm a member of the Soka Gakkai International, which is a lay Buddhist organization. And I think that the biggest role that my faith and my practice has in anything, but in any work that I do, but particularly with something like the climate crisis, which is massive and can be very tough and difficult to even read about and think about, but to be involved, it can be really difficult. So the biggest thing is that my faith gives me is hope, and with my practice, I'm able to create hope in an otherwise bleak situation. And this is because there are many Buddhist teachings which give me hope and prevent me from falling into a state of despair. Just for example, so the Buddhist law is a Buddhist law of cause and effect, and it's a very significant teaching for offering hope for the climate crisis, I feel. And as we well know, and as you said earlier, the climate crisis is a human-made crisis. It's a result of our own greed and foolishness, which has led us down this path of environmental destruction. And Nichiren Daishonin, who is the monk or the priest whose Buddhism that I practice, in his writings he often quotes a sutra that reads, and I'd just like to read this very short quote. He says, "If you want to understand the causes that existed in the past, look at the results as they are manifested in the present. And if you want to understand what results will be manifested in the future, look at the causes that exist in the present." And for me, this reminds me that the future exists in the present moment, and is determined by what I do right now, in this moment and in the next. So the future is not fixed, and I can make a difference. And this teaching really encourages me to keep striving, to keep making positive causes in terms of the climate crisis. And it gives me hope that, you know, by becoming wiser, more compassionate, and making better choices, we can collectively start creating a better future. I don't think this kind of teaching for me exists in many other places. If you read the news, you have conversations, it's such a bleak outlook, and many people are falling into despair because we lack these messages of hope and these real kind of teachings. So I feel really fortunate that I have met a practice and a teaching that enables me to create hope. When I can't find any, I'm able to create it for myself, and that really keeps me going. So yeah, that's a big one for me. And how about you? What role does your faith in the Baha'i tradition have in the work that you do?
I guess there's I mean, so many different ways that it does, but one of the teachings that, or one of the things that has been said that has always deeply impacted on me is it's just a very short couple of sentences, but says we cannot segregate the human heart from the environment outside us, and say that once one of these is reformed, everything will be improved. Humanity is organic with the world. Our inner lives mold the environment and is itself also deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of mankind is the result of these mutual reactions. And so it's that, for me, it's that sense of inner transformation has to take place, but then societal transformations, and those two things impact on us greatly, and we create the world that we live in, and then the world that we live in impacts on our human heart and the way that we are in the world. And so that's always been very powerful for me. And there's also another thing where Baha'u'llah says that nature is the expression of God's will in the contingent world. So that the sense that there's something absolutely sacred about the world of nature, and the natural world and the world that we inhabit is also profoundly impactful. But on a very practical level, the Baha'is very much believes that science and religion are both incredibly important paths to truth. And so that all the scientific evidence out there, I mean, there's absolutely no denying in any way, shape or form that the science is telling us what the problem is. And, you know, so Baha'is are very committed to listening to scientific truth. And, you know, so there's we can't sort of sidestep this issue and ignore it in any way, shape or form. It's real, it is happening, it's impacting on us. The evidence is out there in the world. So we have that scientific truth, but also the religious and spiritual truth that, you know, it is a spiritual crisis. And that kind of combination of trying for me in a very limited way to understand the science of what's happening and what I need to do my, you know, my little bit to use less, consume less, you know, just travel less, all the things that I personally have to do. But also then what does my community do, and how can my community? So, I mean, one of the things that the Baha'i Task Force for COP did was wrote an eco-pledge that now all the Baha'i communities across Scotland, and now it's kind of filtering out to the wider world, are trying to commit to these different pledges within this eco-pledge. It's 19 pledges that Baha'is are going to be implementing in their lives around, you know, what we eat, how we travel, what companies we use, how we disinvest, just everything in there. So I'm really happy with the practical kind of implications. But like you, Lucy, I find that having a faith does give me hope. Having a spiritual practice gives me hope and helps me kind of reflect on what I can do, you know, and where I could be taking action. And it's sometimes, if it's a little bit overwhelming, it's very easy to get into the space of apathy and just think, oh, what can little old me do? Do you know what I mean? It's a big old world and a big old crisis. And actually, faith traditions don't allow you that get out clause. You know, the minute you pray and you meditate, you think, actually, you know, I cannot be apathetic, because this is about justice. This is about our world. This is about the way that we live. Yeah, but you can only work within your sphere of influence. So it's kind of also thinking, well, with what lens am I going to do my bit? You know, where am I going to put my energy? And it is, for me, it's in interfaith engagement and continuing to encourage that engagement with the climate crisis through our dialogues and through our interfaith action. And, you know, we've founded a World Interfaith Harmony Grove of trees. So some of that action can be practical, like planting trees, and, you know, other things like writing multi-faith declarations might not feel quite so practical, but it is, because it's coming from the human heart and saying this is really important. So still in that space where, what next? In
which case I'm going to intervene.
Yeah.
And say that might be a good moment to, you know, open up the floor, as it were. You know, it's wonderful to hear the personal stories of what it's like to be in a place which is so fully in the news for that period of time, and you know, what things felt like, and then also what difference the faith commitment might make. I'm going to start off with a bit of a question for you both. It's not a technical one, but I'm just wondering whether anybody's taken it on board, the actual moment that we're in. And I ask that because some of us love the Greta Thunberg, who was at the COP. I know she's not everyone's favorite, but I just wondered with the both of you, what you thought of her reaction, the blah, blah, blah reaction. In other words, there's a lot of words here, but what difference is it really, really, really going to make? There'll be some differences, maybe some local things could make, and you've mentioned a few there, Maureen, but are we in blah, blah, blah land?
Lucy, I think you can start with that one because, you're closer to the age range anyway of Greta.
That's naughty, Maureen, but I'll take it.
I mean, I think she has a point. I think just from like having conversations with young people, they're very frustrated because I think they recognize the climate crisis is a human rights crisis. It's an environmental crisis. It's all kind of crisis. It's not just kind of a policy response, a policy issue. So when young people get to these kind of spaces full of like dynamism and ideas and creativity, to get to a space that's full of like bureaucracy, it's very, very frustrating. And a lot of young people don't understand, like, so I feel that, Greta definitely speaks on behalf of a lot of young people, not all young people. And she does have a point, but also there are other spaces to take climate action. I feel like there is the policy space, which is important. We need to have policies, strong policies that are tackling environmental destruction and all kinds of things. But there's also room for civil engagement in climate action, which is where we can see the most potential for like more drastic, more kind of fast-paced, rapid action. So many young people are engaged in climate action in their local communities, responding like very quickly to the needs. So when you kind of come from that space and you go into somewhere like COP, you can just see the frustration, and you have those global leaders that come up there and pledge they're going to do this, that, and then fly off in their private jets. It's like, yes, it's very frustrating to see those kind of things. So I have empathy for Greta. Maureen, what do you think of the blah blah blah?
Yeah, there was certainly a lot of blah blah blah, wasn't there? I also have, perhaps this is more of a Baha'i perspective than my own, like interfaith perspective. But there is a sense, certainly in the Baha'i community, that global governance is really, really important. And, I've sort of reflected on that in relationship to, say, the space that we're in, which is Scotland. And so Scotland is doing a fair bit, towards mitigating the effects of the climate crisis. But even if Scotland gets it 100% right, the whole country is sustainable, and everything we're doing is renewable, and it's all, hunky-dory, Scotland's looking great, thanks very much, it will make not a blind bit of difference to the climate crisis. Because actually there has to be radical global steps taken. This idea that we need to be in this as a whole humanity. And we've seen all the injustices of the global north and the way that the south are being impacted, and yet most of the environmental taking, if you like, from the earth's resources, etc., are in the global north. And so I think our politicians in the north will go kicking and screaming into any sort of international treaty, because us that are used to our luxuries, our central heating, our travel, our, you know, whatever, we're going to have to amend our way of living, you know, our way of being. And I think something has to shift at the global level. And I do see the negotiations as critical, but I don't think they're being effective. I don't think they're being close to radical enough. I don't think they're being implemented. So who's going to enforce implementation of the things that are going to count? Do you know what I mean? Who's going to do it? Who's holding to account? You saw that scientific, I've forgotten, it's the IPPC report, is that right? Got the right word for that. Shows you how not that technical I am. And where the scientists were saying this is the reality, and we absolutely have to make radical change. So there's going to have to be changes at that international global governance level, as well as the way we live our lives, it rooted in the local place where we live, you know, right here, right now, and changing all of that. So I think blah is important, and you know, talking and dialogue and coming up with treaties and signing them, all of that kind of stuff is hugely important. But what's even more important is implementation, and there seems to be some kind of gross gap between the desire of humanity, the promises that are being made by governments across the world, and then the actual implementation. Yeah. And I mean, in a way that's reflected in our own lives. I know what I really want to do. I want to eat loads less meat, yeah? And then 90% of the time I get there, and then sometimes you're just like, but it's, you know, we have to not slip. It's like we're on this knife edge for humanity now, and governments have to just up their game. Yeah. Okay,
thanks, Maureen. I'm just trying to look to see if there's any hands going up. Not so many, or questions in the chat area. Anybody want to make a point? If not, I might even call you in.
Put my hand up.
Okay, June. Hello. Yes, I see it now.
Yes, I think that the climate crisis, I mean, I'm a Christian priest, it's a critique of our faith. We cannot say that our faith, the Christian faith, I can't speak for any others, has not contributed to this. We've had a faith which is concentrated on human beings and not on the environment. So it means that in our faith tradition, we have to rethink our theology. We need a theology of the soil. We need a theology of the earth. We need to revisit the notion that in Christianity, the first revelation of God is the natural world. And somehow or other, in much of our preaching and in much of our prayers, we've concentrated on human beings and completely ignored the environment. So when I lead the notion of confession, I always say, let us think of the times when we failed to see God in one another, in ourselves, and in the natural world. And the president, one of the people from Greenpeace was in there, said, do you know, it's the first time I've ever heard the natural world mentioned in a Christian service. Well, what a condemnation of Christianity that is. So I think it's not how can the faiths contribute, but certainly in my own faith, we have to see how much we've contributed and how much theology needs to change in order to have a new view of God, a bigger view of God, a cosmic view of God, rather than the rather limited view that we've actually had. So yes, my faith confirms me. I lament in it and I rejoice in it, but I also critique it very hard.
Okay, June, thank you very much. Very powerful statement there. Jamie, I think, has a hand, although he doesn't have a face. Well, he does now.
Hi, Jamie.
Hi, thank you. June, what you just said was really powerful, and I couldn't agree more with you. However, I'm not a Christian, I'm a Buddhist, but I think all faiths have to take the position that you've just outlined, to be honest. My question is, you know, I've been involved in this climate issue for a few years now, and I was on the run up to COP. I was very, very involved in the movement called Faith for the Climate and Make COP Count, and it became more and more clear to me as we tried to sort of do outreach work, or they tried to do outreach work, that actually getting through to religions and members of religions is very difficult. And to leadership, it's a difficult ask, and it's not going fast enough as far as I'm concerned. And we also know that, you know, from what you both have been saying today, is that, you know, a structural change is what is needed, and this massive rush towards more and more and more, and growth is the problem, and that is an ethical problem, as Maureen was saying. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more from both of you, and I know this is a difficult question, about how your faith, or how faiths generally can help in that structural change that we need to see take place. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. Anybody want to pick that up between the two of you, or anybody else, actually? You know, we're all in this together, as they say now.
Emma Salter has her hand up.
Okay.
I'll wait for the previous question to be answered.
It's a different one. Okay. Maureen, were you going to chip in?
Well, I think, yeah, also I'm going to ask Lucy to think of that, because I think it's a really, really important question. I mean, in my own faith tradition, there's at the moment, and there has been for quite a number of years, and it's really important, and a sense of building community, and what does a safe, open, inclusive, welcoming community look like? You know, how do we take care of our children and our youth and our elderly, and how do we engage with others from other faiths and no faiths? What do we contribute at the local level? And I've seen that in a way has involved quite a big structural change within our own faith tradition. And I've been astonished at how rapidly the community has responded to such a big change. From, you know, the Baha'i faith is often looked at as a very big international kind of, a lot, you know, Baha'u'llah spoke about one world, one planet, one people, all that kind of big global stuff. And so Baha'is have been very outward looking in an international way. And the institutions of our faith are pushing us to actually, all that was good and great, it's fine, but actually where the real work takes place is with your neighbors, with your, you know, with your street, with your village, with your community. And that was it's been a big mind shift, you know, and how do you do that? Because actually it's much more exciting to be involved. You think it is much more exciting to be involved, not the international stuff. But once you start really engaging at the local level, it's heart transforming, because then you see the struggles that people are actually living with all around you, and you recognize them in yourself too, the struggles that you have. And that's been a big structural change within my faith tradition, but I don't know if other faith traditions are also, you know, the focus on the environment and the focus on community building has been a huge transformational thing in my community. But Lucy, I don't know, what about yourself?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the question, Jamie. Difficult one. I think it's really important to have a vision of what a better world could look like, because without that, you're just fighting against things that you know are not right. But what's the alternative? I remember before I met the practice and didn't really have a vision. I was quite an angry young person, and I met someone on a plane once, and he asked me about. He was a yogi, and he was asking me about what I do, and you know, I ended up quite venting about stuff. Like, I want to change this, I want to like fight against that. And he was like, you have to have a vision of what you're fighting for, because if you're trying to take something, remove something, you're going to leave a void, and that could be filled with something like even worse, for example. So he was like, you have to have a vision about what you want to be contributing or how you want the world to be. And the practice has given me that. In Buddhism, it's a world where the dignity of life is respected. This is what we are aiming towards, to create a world where the dignity of life is respected. And I use that as a kind of mirror whenever whatever space I'm in. I ask myself the question, does this reflect the dignity of life? And if the answer is no, then I think how could it look? And it's amazing, actually, the difference that one person with a strong vision, with a very clear understanding that this is not right and this is how it should be, can actually have a difference. So I think just having a vision of what we want the world to look like, what it should look like, if we have equality and respect and dignity, and really just kind of whatever field that we're in, whatever, even if it's in our home, even if it's in like a very micro area, just to have that vision and really work towards it, having the courage. Yeah, that's
okay.
That's
Thank you. Yeah, tremendous. I'm going to call in Emma now, who's had her hand up, and then someone
Thank you,
else
Alan.
after that. Okay.
Thank you for sharing this space. The conversation is really interesting and really inspiring. So thank you so much for that. I hope that my question on my invitation for comment builds on what's just been said about structures and community. I'm interested to know, both in the panel and anyone in the meetings, opinions about the intersection here between the climate crisis, sustainable crisis, formal education, and whether faith communities have a role to play. So Ofsted in England and Wales, I'm sorry, I don't know so much for Scotland, Maureen. One of the Ofsted strands is around spiritual, moral, social and cultural needs of children, and that formal education meets these needs. And to my mind, a lot of what's been said around the climate crisis being not, that was such a lovely thing that you said, that it's not a climate crisis, it's our crisis and our responsibility, and the links there with spirituality in the many different ways that might be understood. That whether education around these issues should be more formally embedded in formal education, and whether faith communities have any role to play within that, and within dialoguing with young people within those formal education spaces. Just interested in people's thoughts about it.
Great question, and I see Brian has his hand up, and he's an absolute what's the word? Pioneer of interfaith relations. So I would love to ask Brian if he might want to speak about that, because he's also been very involved in education.
Sure.
Well, thank you, Maureen. In fact, this is prompted by something which you said in one of your contributions, where you referred to people who belong to religious traditions and communities and people who do not. And I think one of the interesting things that has been happening is that there has been some movement between people who are not religious and people who are religious, in recognition that we are all part of one world and one global community. And I think it's very important that we strengthen those bonds as well as the interreligious bonds.
Thanks, Brian. That helps me actually think with Emma's question, because I think that the educational world is where religious and non-religious and secular ideas and ideas about justice and the climate and everything, it's such a critical space. And I think absolutely all of this should be part of the curriculum. I don't know exactly what you would call it. I mean, you have religious, moral and philosophical education in Scotland at 50 minutes a week. Yeah, that's just not going to cut it, you know. And these are the issues that young people want to be talking about, and they want to know all the different facets about how does it impact on asylum seekers and refugees? How does it impact on economics? How does it impact on health? How does it impact on governance? You know, it's just, and our young people are bright, intelligent, thoughtful, and the leaders of the future. So to me, yeah, it should just 100% be part and parcel. And the faith communities, I mean, there's lots of educational things go on in faith communities, don't they? From madrasas to, I don't know, Baha'i children and youth classes to Jewish things, Sunday school classes in churches. So yeah, the informal education sector, and I think Lucy would speak to that very well, is another area where lots of educational work should be going on around this.
Okay, thanks.
Can I add something very quickly? Yeah. Just climate empowerment is so important for citizens and young people to have and education is a big role. So there's a framework in the United Nations Climate Convention, ACE. It's Action for Climate Empowerment, and it encompasses things like citizen participation, education, but it's not one of those things that gets a lot of attention. There is so many people putting like huge amount of effort to try and get this like as a standard that all countries have to have in their national curriculums, but this is still a work in progress. But yeah, climate empowerment is really important. So for people to be educated and to be able to participate and have that awareness and opportunity.
Okay. I'm going to, I see our good friend Kusamita from the States has posted in the chat some links to the Parliament of Religions materials. It's a superb book. She's mentioned there, Faith for Earth, a call for action. But I wanted to try and bring her in and hope she doesn't mind I'm springing this on her. I know that the Parliament followed the COP26 process very closely, and you know, you had your people there monitoring and sending messages back and reflecting every day. Is there a, you know, from where you are, from the Parliament perspective, was there a sort of something that emerged that somehow A, would provide the hope, but B, also some kind of practical handle on what the next steps might be from, you know, the biggest interfaith organization in the world, probably.
Thank you, Alan. I don't think we are the biggest. I think the United Religions Initiative is the biggest.
Ah, is that right?
There are 1,000 cooperation circles around the world, and a very big commitment to climate change and the environment by URI, which is hopeful. I'm not sure how to, you know, right after the Glasgow COP, people were saying we really have to be careful about this rhetoric of Glasgow being do or die, you know, is like it's all up or it's all down after Glasgow, because that isn't true. And our US climate envoy, John Kerry, was saying this is the beginning of a process of raising ambition. And of course, people had extremely mixed feelings about COP26. And one of the comments people made was that the non-governmental organizations, civil society, didn't have access to the negotiators. There were all kinds of logistical problems, and you know, there was we hoped that people were paying attention to the marchers and the demonstrations and the interfaith service and so forth. And before I go on, I want to say I'm the chair of the board of the Interfaith Center of New York, and hello to Maureen. And thank you for hosting Chloe Breyer, who I work with very closely. So, and but next year's COP is going to be in Egypt in a resort area. And what I'm hearing is that the problem of access and so forth is going to be even worse. And what I understand from all of this is that mobilization of religious communities on a vast scale between COPs, as well as what we can do at COPs, is really necessary. Now, you know, whatever works for mobilization, for trying to make an impact on governmental leaders, and for changing our own practices. And the psychologists and sociologists say that one of the biggest influences for change is what your family members are doing, what your neighbors are doing. So I put solar panels on my house. I've just got rid of my gas heating system. And one of the reasons I'm doing that is not just it's a good in itself, is that I can tell other people I did it. You know? You know, it's like my house is no longer on fossil fuels. And so you just heard it from me, but I still have to change my cooking range. So we have to change ourselves, and we also have to try to change the whole system in any way we can think of. And I'll leave it at that. You know,
yeah.
Hope is, you know, for Christians, at least, hope is a commandment, you know, and we often hear it's not the same thing as optimism.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Kusamita. Well, you know, it's good to have that reflection, I think, from the Parliament of Religions. And I just commend the book.
And Alan,
yeah.
The book is free.
Yeah.
And
it's terrific. It really is.
And so you can.
Are you going to hold it up or something? Is that what?
I am.
There it is. But you can have a PDF of it if you insist on that method.
For yourself personally, in any kind of classes or discussion groups you have, please use it. It's very beautiful and moving, and it will, I hope, will give inspiration and maybe hope.
It's full of pictures, so you should like it for that reason, at least.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Elizabeth Harris has a hand up, I think. Is that right?
Yes, I did have a hand up, yes. I suppose my question concerns civil disobedience and whether there is any role for civil disobedience in the kind of lobbying that has to be done. I sometimes get quite depressed when I hear about the corporate interests that are kind of pulling the rug under what Joe Biden wants to do, you know, from even members of the Democrat Party who represent states that gain their wealth from fossil fuels, scuppering what he wanted to do after COP. And these strong corporate interests will do, I don't know, will do anything to profit. So is there how can we deal with these interests? And is there a place for civil disobedience?
Good question. Good question. Is there a reflection about that? I mean, Lucy, I would think it's a kind of young people sort of, yes, let's get on the street and whatever. I don't say that mockingly. I say that approvingly, actually.
Yeah, I think, I mean, of course, there's the youth climate protest, the school strikes for climate. But in terms of, Elizabeth, what you were saying about kind of corporate interests and how to kind of lessen the grip that they have in this space, I met many youth at COP who went there kind of networking and really kind of needing funding for their fantastic ideas, and many of them actually turned down huge amounts of funding because they had vetted those who were like trying to give them funding, and a lot of them were kind of, you know, fossil fuel companies and other ones that are kind of really heavily still involved in polluting. And so these young people are really kind of, you know, not just taking anything that comes their way, but really scrutinizing and living up to kind of what they're saying. They're like, we'd rather, you know, have no resources and still try to do our best than be, you know, used as puppets by these big corporations. So any kind of action to resist and to safeguard citizens from these kind of powers, I think is a is a great thing. And I saw many of that happening with especially youth groups, really kind of just turning down these offers of support from companies who are not holding up their side of the bargain and are not really, one example.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, you know, non-violent protests are definitely, I mean, we have such a history of them making a difference, from Gandhi to Martin Luther King, and the indigenous, and we haven't mentioned yet just the wisdom of indigenous people and the role that I think they have to play in all of this
absolutely
climate, you know, negotiations, and making sure that their voice is heard. And so my husband and I actually joined Extinction Rebellion. We felt very rebellious and very excited about it all, but I wouldn't be doing anything violent, or I wouldn't be doing it, you know, but I did feel that it was such a crisis that, and you know, we were on the road to extinction, that I wanted to mark that in some way. And I think with civil disobedience, people have to decide what's right for them in relationship to it, because some faith traditions would be reluctant, and others it would be like that this is at the forefront of what we have to do. And so I don't think there needs to be a judgment on people about at what level they engage with civil disobedience. And it's certainly a way to get attention, 100%. It's a way to get attention. But then there's lots of other ways as well. So it's balancing it all and finding what's right for you within your faith tradition. But there are, I would have hoped that if I was in America in the 1950s and 60s, that I'd have been marching in the civil rights movement, which was, you know, absolutely
life-changing.
Life-changing. And Gandhi and the salt marshes.
Country-changing, yeah.
Etc., you know, yeah.
So every now and again, you get some of those things that come together. Kusamita, did you want to?
Yes.
Another word?
I was in the People's Climate March in 2014, and there were 400,000 people marching in New York City alone. And all over the world, these actions took place. And there's a serious view that this really affected the outcome of the Paris climate meeting. And in the People's Climate March of 400,000 people, there was a code of conduct. And I wrote about it, and it was actually came out in World Faith's Insight.
Very good magazine.
And and it said, we will not do anything that can be interpreted as an intention of violence, or do any violent acts. We will not take any drugs or intoxicants. We will not carry weapons. We will treat everyone with respect, and we will hold each other accountable, which is a crucial part of adopting a code like that. It's not just everyone adopted privately, but we all adopted, and we hold each other responsible to abide by it. So that was 400,000 people with a non-violent code of action. And if it's and if you have this code of action and you publicized it, then you have something to do when there are provocateurs who try to make it seem as if someone was violent, because that can happen. So and about Extinction Rebellion, I know, haven't they been tagged as a terrorist organization?
Oh yeah, that's,
you know. But speaking of money, divestment from fossil fuels is important. And not too long ago, I went to see if Columbia University had divested, and they just did very recently. And you know who made them do it? Apparently there was an Extinction Rebellion group on campus.
Wow.
that really leaned on the president of the university and the trustees. So it's not just like, you know, you could be disobedient, and you could also be very effective.
Thank you very much. That's a great story. That some things can be effective. Fantastic. I think we've got time maybe for one other contribution, but we said we'd finish towards 7:15. It's coming up for that. people who've stayed the course. Well, I don't see any more hands. There's quite a few
Lydia.
people.
Lydia has her
I'm
hand
very
up.
sorry. Lydia, hello.
Hi.
Good, from Harrow, yes.
I noticed that at the COP26, obviously, there are various groups attending, different levels, I guess, governmental, and we have the civil society, the media as well, is a big aspect of this, and the corporate world. So my question is whether room for dialogue between religion and the media, and also religion and business. Do you see this as something that may be developed further at the COP27? You know, in my community in Harrow, in our own Baha'i tradition faith community, we have different levels of spreading this interest in the environment, whether it's through our children's classes, or junior youth, or youth activities. We have devotionals, and obviously through our interaction with such wonderful groups as Interfaith. So on the bigger level, I just wondered whether there is any room at all given to you to be able to communicate and have this dialogue with both the media as well as the corporate world. Thank you.
Does anyone have just a brief response to that anywhere?
The Anglican reorganization of bishops, I think they're going to have a bishop who's involved with environment. I'm not absolutely sure about that. And the other thing I wanted to say is that David Attenborough's Green Planet series is making it very clear that if we don't do something immediately, then it's really going to have devastating consequences.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. That's true. There's a lot of communications. June.
I think Lydia's made a very good point, and the way the media treat Extinction Rebellion, and also have treated, I'm thinking of the wonderful huge statue of the refugee that they virtually didn't cover at all. But I think just to add to a point that was made earlier, it's important that the groups who were not represented at COP, and their reports say this, women, ethnic minorities, indigenous people, and youth, all of those are identified. It's important that that group of people liaise with the media and don't just leave it to the people who were well represented there. So in a sense, it rests on people, you know, those groups of people to make their voices heard. And they often feel that they can't make their voices heard. But encouraging those groups to make their opinions heard, I think is really important. So who talks to the media, I think is very important, because that's who is being heard. So I think I just wanted to add that to what you said, Lydia, that you get different perspectives.
Thank you, June. Yeah, a good follow-up. I think I'm going to draw us to a close, but I'll just say a little bit in response to June's point there that's applicable. I think I have a daughter whose job is communications with Friends of the Earth, and she too was at the COP26 and daily pumped out reflections and stories of the things that that were happening. I think she would say that maybe only a small percentage of the things that were pumped out were kind of picked up, but there was a lot of things being pumped out, that's for sure. But the effort is there, and but I agree there's a big filtering system that goes on. Well, I think it's maybe just for me to thank everybody, but particularly, of course, Lucy and Maureen for this very stimulating conversation. Actually, I started out by saying, in one day I might go from despair to hope and despair again, and so on, about depending what I've just read often and which newspaper it was. Well, I think an event like this and a sharing that we've just had has certainly left me feeling a bit more hopeful and a bit more upbeat about the whole thing. There are things to do, but there are perspectives that we've set forth that I think provide the hope. It has to happen on many different levels, and people have spoken about that: individual and local, institutional, governmental, corporate, international. And there are the voices there. It's a matter of I hope, sort of harnessing them a bit more rapidly and with depth. You've all spoken that faith does have a role. There's a spirituality there that connects, as someone said, I think it was Maureen, the human heart and the environmental. And I think actually every religion under the sun does that. Otherwise, why would it have an effect around the world? Why would it go anywhere? We have to have a vision. I think Lucy said that. And that's what we're in the business for. But it has to be a vision, of course, that makes sense and a vision that's going to connect with people's hearts and their minds and their actions. So good luck, everyone. Thanks again for joining in wherever you are in this globe of ours. It's been great to have you. Thanks very much. Let's have a round of applause for Maureen and Lucy and for everybody.
And thank you, Alan, and thank you, Warwick, as well, for all the communications and for holding this space. Thank you so much.
We did record the thing. I don't quite know what we're going to do with that. We might be able to, you know, boil something down to make a bit of an article about it. We'll have to see. If there's a budding writer out there who wants to do that, then you've got the email address, I'm sure. Thanks, everybody. Very good to see you.
Thank you. See you for the blather.
Thank you.